Claude responded, "When my son got married, I never told him that I'd inherited $11 million from his uncle. When my son got married, I never told him that I'd inherited $11 million from his uncle. Thank God I kept that to myself. Because 6 weeks after the honeymoon, my new daughter-in-law showed up at my door with a lawyer and a stack of papers asking me to sign over power of attorney, just in case anything happened to me. She had no idea I already knew exactly what she was after. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 64 years old. I live outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. And until last spring, I was just a retired electrician who spent his afternoons restoring an old Ford pickup in the driveway. Nobody at the feed store looked at me twice. Nobody knew what was sitting in an account with my name on it. And that's exactly how I wanted it. Stick around, folks, because this one's going to surprise you. If you're new to this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Because trust me, you don't want to miss how this ends. My older brother's name was Dale. For most of our lives, Dale and I weren't close in the way brothers are supposed to be. He was 7 years older, and by the time I was out of high school, he'd already built a construction supply company out of a single flatbed truck and a rented lot in Broken Arrow. 20 years later, that company had contracts across 3 states and a warehouse the size of an airplane hangar. Dale wanted me to come work for him back when I was young, offered me a foreman job more than once. I told him I was happy running wire for a living, happy with something smaller and quieter. He never really understood that, and I think some part of him thought I was judging his ambition, which I never was. We had a falling out over our mother's house after she passed, a stupid argument about who should keep her furniture, and after that we mostly just sent birthday cards, a phone call at Christmas if we remembered. Nothing more than that for almost 15 years. I used to tell people it didn't bother me. That was a lie I got real comfortable telling myself. Then one Thursday afternoon in April, I got a call from a hospital in Tulsa. Dale had suffered a stroke in his sleep. He never woke up. 71 years old, gone just like that. No warning at all. I sat in my kitchen holding the phone long after the woman on the other end had hung up, not sure what a man is even supposed to feel about a brother he barely spoke to anymore. Grief came eventually, real grief, but underneath it was something else too, something heavier and stranger, a kind of dread about what would happen next. I didn't know yet that the next few months would turn my whole life sideways. The will was read 9 days later in a lawyer's office on the edge of downtown. A woman named Constance Reyes, who had handled Dale's business affairs for almost 2 decades. I figured maybe he'd left me some tools, a truck, something to remember him by. I did not expect Miss Reyes to slide a folder across her desk and tell me that Dale had left me almost everything. The warehouse property, his share of the company he'd sold off 18 months before he died, every investment account he'd built up over 40 years of grinding it out. Once the taxes and the legal fees were sorted, she said the number in a flat, careful voice, like she was handling something fragile. Just over $11 million. I remember asking her to repeat it, not because I hadn't heard her, but because my brain flat out refused to process it the first time. She told me there was also a letter, sealed, handwritten, addressed only to me. I didn't open it right there in her office. I folded it into my shirt pocket and drove home with both hands locked on the wheel, like the truck might tip over if I took a curve too fast. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I made a decision that changed everything that came after it. I decided not to tell a soul. Not my ex-wife, not the fellas I still golfed with on Saturdays, and especially not my son Marcus, who was 4 months out from his own wedding. I told myself it was temporary, that I just needed time to get my head straight before money started changing how people looked at me. I had no idea yet how right that gut feeling was going to turn out to be. Marcus had been seeing a woman named Brooke Talley for close to 3 years by the time Dale passed. Brooke was 28, worked in what she called wealth consulting, though whenever I asked her to explain it plainly, the answer always came out slippery. Something about helping families structure their assets for the future. She was sharp, well-spoken, always had a compliment ready for my garden or my truck or whatever happened to be sitting in front of her. The kind of charm that shines in a 10-minute conversation and starts feeling a little too polished after an hour. Marcus was crazy about her, and I wanted to be happy for my boy. I really did try. But something about the way Brooke asked questions never sat right with me. Early on, before I even knew about the inheritance, she asked me once over dinner, real casual, whether Dale and I talked much, and whether there was family money anywhere that Marcus might need to think about someday. I laughed it off, told her Dale and I hadn't spoken in years. She nodded slow, like she was filing that away, and brought it up again a few weeks later. dressed up inside a different question about Marcus's retirement accounts. When she and Marcus got engaged that summer, right around the time Dale's estate was still working its way through probate, Brooke started showing up to Sunday dinners with little comments about setting the family up the right way and protecting what matters long term. I told myself I was being an old paranoid fool, that plenty of young folks think about money before a wedding. But some quiet part of me had already started keeping score. And once you start keeping score like that, you can't stop. Wedding planning turned into its own kind of pressure that fall. Brooke wanted a venue out past Jenks, an old restored barn that charged more for one Saturday evening than most people make in 3 months. Marcus kept apologizing to me about the cost, saying they'd figure out a way to make it work on their own credit. And every time he said that, something in my chest twisted a little tighter. I had $11 million sitting quiet in an account, and my son was checking his savings app at the kitchen table trying to figure out how to afford a caterer. I ended up quietly covering most of the wedding costs myself, wiring the deposits straight to the venue and the band, telling Marcus it came from savings and a small payout from his uncle's estate. That part wasn't exactly a lie, just not the whole truth either. Brooke, for her part, seemed awfully interested in exactly how those payments were showing up. She asked Marcus more than once who was handling the deposits and whether his dad had come into some money recently, saying it light and joking, but her eyes weren't joking one bit when she said it. Marcus brushed it off every time, told her I was just a generous father who'd been saving up for this his whole life. I let him believe that story too, because it was easier than opening a door I wasn't ready to open yet. Looking back now, I can see exactly how careful Brooke was being, laying her groundwork, asking her questions in a way that always sounded harmless on the surface. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking a nervous bride. I was wrong about that, and I'd find out exactly how wrong soon enough. The wedding day itself was, if I'm honest, about as beautiful as I've ever seen. Marcus looked just like his mother did when she walked down that same kind of aisle 30-some years back. And for a few hours that afternoon, I let myself just be a proud father instead of a man sitting on a secret the size of a small fortune. The barn looked incredible that evening. String lights strung up in the rafters, everybody laughing and dressed up nice. Brooke's mother, a woman named Sherry from over in Arkansas, with a talent for complimenting people in a way that also sounded like an insult, cornered me near the bar and said out of nowhere, "It's such a comfort knowing Marcus has a father who can help them get started right." I smiled and said something that didn't mean anything, but I noticed the exact way she watched my face after she said it, like she was checking for a reaction. During the toast, Brooke stood up with her glass and talked about building something secure together and making smart decisions as a family, which struck me as a strange thing to bring up at a wedding instead of talking about love or partnership or any of the usual stuff. A few folks laughed politely. Marcus looked happy and a little embarrassed, the way a groom does when a toast gets slightly off kilter. I clapped right along with everybody else, but underneath that applause, I felt that same cold, quiet feeling I'd had at that dinner table months before. Something about Brooke's focus on money, even here, even on her own wedding day, told me this wasn't nervous excitement. This was a woman who'd already been doing arithmetic on numbers she wasn't supposed to officially know about yet. I danced with my son. I hugged him tight. I told him I loved him and that I was proud of the man he'd turned out to be. And every single word of that was true. But driving home alone that night, I knew something was coming, even if I couldn't have told you exactly what yet. The honeymoon lasted 8 days, a trip down to the Gulf Coast that I quietly paid for as a wedding gift, dressed up again as money I'd supposedly had tucked away. When they got back, something in the air shifted. Brooke started calling me. Not Marcus, me directly, which she'd never really done before. She'd ask if I wanted to grab lunch, or if I needed help sorting through Dale's old paperwork, offering to take some of that off my plate, something she had zero training in and even less real interest in before the wedding. At first, I told myself this was just a daughter-in-law trying to build a relationship with her new father-in-law. I wanted to believe that, because some part of me still hoped Brooke would turn out to be good for my son. But the calls kept coming, always friendly, always casual, and always eventually circling back around to a version of the same question. How was I managing things financially now that Dale's estate had settled? Did I have somebody helping me handle the accounts? Had I ever thought about consolidating everything so it'd be simpler to track as I got older? She asked all of it with a smile in her voice, the same way you'd ask somebody about their garden or their bowling league. But I spent 31 years pulling wire through walls in other people's houses, and you learn quick how to spot somebody who's buttering you up before they ask for something bigger. Brooke was doing the exact same thing, just with a business degree and a wedding band. One Sunday afternoon, she showed up unannounced with a six-pack of the beer I like, sat on my back porch for damn near 2 hours, and steered the conversation no fewer than four separate times toward protecting assets for the whole family long term. I nodded along and gave her nothing. But that night, I sat back down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd made my decision to keep quiet in the first place, and I admitted something to myself. My daughter-in-law knew. I needed to find out how much Brooke actually knew, and how in the world she'd found it out. So I called an old buddy of mine, Ray Kessler, a fellow I'd worked alongside on job sites for almost 25 years before he left the trade to do private investigation work, mostly background checks for small contractors who'd gotten burned before. I laid the whole thing out for him, over coffee, at a diner off Route 66. My brother, the will, the 11 million, Brooke's strange questions, creeping in earlier and earlier. Ray didn't look the least bit surprised. He told me probate filings are public record in Oklahoma, same as most states, meaning anybody with a little patience and a library card practically can search the county court website and find out exactly what an estate was worth and who ended up with it. Took him about 20 minutes at his own kitchen table to pull up Dale's filing and confirm the number himself, just to show me how simple it really was. Then he asked me something that made my stomach drop clean through the floor. He asked me when exactly Brooke had pushed Marcus to set a wedding date. I told him, and Ray pulled up the date Dale's estate had gone public with the county, cross-referenced it against the obituary listings from the paper. Dale died in April. The filing went public in early May. Marcus and Brooke, who'd been dating for years without ever seriously talking marriage, suddenly picked their date and sent out invitations the third week of May. Ray looked at me across that diner table and said, real quiet, "Walter, I think you need to ask yourself if this wedding was ever really about your son." I didn't want to hear it. I told myself it could just be coincidence, that plenty of couples finally set a date after years of talking about it, that I was building a whole conspiracy out of timing and one too many questions on my porch. But some part of me, the part that had spent months keeping score without even meaning to, already knew Ray was onto something, and I needed real proof before I said a word to anybody. Ray offered to dig deeper, and I told him to go ahead before I'd even finished thinking it through, because at that point I needed the truth more than I needed my own comfort. It took him almost 3 weeks. What he found wasn't just uncomfortable. It was almost textbook. Brooke had been engaged once before, 5 years earlier, to a man named Curtis, whose family owned a chain of auto parts stores across the Texas Panhandle. That engagement ended abruptly 7 months in, right around the time Curtis's father sold the business outright to a bigger chain. There was no lawsuit, no public mess, just a quiet breakup that Curtis's old college roommate described to Ray as her losing interest the second the money situation changed. Ray also found a pattern in Brooke's job history. 3 different positions at 3 different firms in 6 years, each one ending not long after she'd built close relationships with wealthier clients and started inserting herself into their personal financial decisions. At one firm, she'd gotten written up for advising an elderly client to add her as a co-signer on a private account before her supervisor caught wind of it and let her go quietly rather than make it public. None of it was criminal. Exactly. Nothing that would ever hold up clean in a courtroom. But all of it painted the same picture, over and over. A woman who found opportunity in relationships and moved fast the second she sensed real money nearby. I sat with that folder in my hands a long time out in the garage that night, the same garage where I always felt most useful, most myself. And I felt something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with my brother's money and everything to do with my son's future. I wasn't angry yet. I was getting ready. I decided not to say anything to Marcus right away, because I needed to see exactly how far Brooke was willing to take this, and because some stubborn part of me still hoped I was wrong. I didn't have to wait long. About 5 weeks after the honeymoon, Brooke called and said she wanted to stop by with something important, just paperwork stuff, nothing to worry about, in that same easy tone she used for everything. I told her to come by Saturday morning. When Saturday rolled around, she pulled into my driveway with a leather folder under her arm, and a man I didn't recognize walking beside her, a man she introduced simply as Grant. He's an attorney. He helps our family with this kind of thing. My stomach dropped the second I clocked the business card in his shirt pocket. Brooke sat right down at my kitchen table, the very same table, and slid that folder across toward me with a smile that didn't quite make it up to her eyes. She explained it as a family protection plan, something her financial advisor had recommended, papers that would name her as a secondary contact with power of attorney on certain accounts, in case anything ever happened to me. She framed the whole thing around love and caution, and looking out for an aging father-in-law. She even brought up Dale's sudden passing as an example, said it so gently, like she was genuinely worried about me, like this whole visit was born purely out of concern. Grant sat quiet at the end of the table with his briefcase, waiting on a signature that would have handed my daughter-in-law legal reach into money she wasn't even supposed to know existed yet. I looked at that folder a long moment. Then I looked up at Brooke and asked her, calm as I could manage, if she wanted to know how I'd found out about Curtis. Her face changed instantly, the polish cracking right off her in real time. She asked what in the world I was talking about, but her voice had lost that easy, practiced smoothness, and something tighter and more nervous took its place. I told her plainly. No yelling, no theatrics, just facts laid out one after the other, the way I used to walk an apprentice through a wiring diagram. I told her about the probate timeline, about the engagement that ended right when Curtis's family sold their business, about the job history Ray had pulled together, about the co-signer situation that got her let go quietly. I told her I knew about her questions at that first dinner, her phone calls about consolidating accounts, every single breadcrumb she thought she'd scattered so carefully over the past year. Grant sat frozen at the end of the table, realizing real quick this wasn't the routine signing he'd been called in for. Brooke tried to recover, said I was misreading everything, that this was purely about family security, that any reasonable person plans ahead for the worst. I let her talk for almost a full minute without cutting in, because I wanted her to hear exactly how thin it sounded once it was actually being said out loud, instead of dressed up in a soft, caring voice on my back porch. When she finally ran out of steam, I slid that folder back across the table toward her, closed, unsigned, and told her I wasn't signing a single thing that day, or any day after it. Then I told her something else, something I'd been sitting on for weeks, waiting for exactly the right moment to say. I told her Marcus was going to hear every single word of this from me before the week was out. Grant left almost immediately, gathering his briefcase without another word, wanting no part of whatever this had turned into. Brooke stayed a few minutes longer, swinging back and forth between anger and a kind of desperate backpedaling, telling me I was going to destroy her marriage over assumptions, that Marcus would never believe any of this coming from me, that it would just sound like a jealous old man trying to control his son's life. That part actually worried me some, because she wasn't entirely wrong about how it could look from the outside. A father with a secret fortune suddenly accusing his new daughter-in-law right after refusing to hand over any control. So instead of just giving Marcus my version of the story, I decided to show him the actual proof. The probate timeline, Ray's full report, and something I hadn't mentioned to Brooke yet at all, a recording. I'd started recording our conversation quiet on my phone the second Grant walked through my door, tucked into my shirt pocket, because some instinct told me I'd need more than just my word alone. I called Marcus that same afternoon and asked him to come by the house without Brooke. Told him it was important, told him I loved him, and that none of this was easy for me either. He showed up about 2 hours later looking nervous, asking right off if I was sick, if something was wrong health-wise. I told him no, that this was about something else entirely, something I should have told him months back. I sat him down at that same kitchen table, poured him coffee the way he'd always taken it since he was a teenager working summers with me on job sites. And I told him everything, starting with Dale's death and ending with the lawyer who'd been sitting in that very chair 3 hours before. Marcus sat completely still while I talked, his coffee going cold in front of him, untouched. I told him about the 11 million first, watched his face move through shock and then something close to hurt, asking quiet why I hadn't told him sooner. I explained honestly that I was scared of exactly what had ended up happening, that money changes how folks look at you, and I hadn't wanted it changing how anybody looked at his wedding either. He nodded slow, taking that part in, and I could see him understanding it even through the sting. Then I moved on to Brooke, and that's when his whole posture shifted. I laid the probate timeline out in front of him, showed him the dates, side by side, Dale's death, the public filing, the sudden wedding date, 2 weeks apart, almost to the day. I told him about Curtis, about the auto parts business, about the co-signer situation from her old job. I played him a short clip of the recording from that morning, just enough for him to hear her voice explaining the family protection plan to a lawyer she'd brought without asking me first. Marcus didn't cry right off. He just sat there real quiet for almost a full minute, staring at the folder Brooke had left behind on my counter, the one I still hadn't signed. When he finally spoke, his voice was steadier than I expected. He said, "She asked me twice last month if you'd ever mentioned changing your will." I hadn't known that detail. It confirmed everything Ray had already found, laid out fresh and painful straight from his own memory. He thanked me quiet for telling him. Then he asked me for the folder, the recording, and Ray's full report, and said he needed to go home and talk to his wife himself, tonight, alone. I didn't hear from him for 3 days, and those were 3 of the longest days I'd had since the funeral. When he finally called, his voice sounded worn out but clear, the voice of a man who'd already made up his mind and just needed to say it out loud to make it real. He told me the conversation with Brooke had gone about as bad as I figured it would. She denied everything at first, then shifted straight to blaming me, calling me manipulative for hiding the inheritance in the first place, trying to twist the whole situation around so her own behavior looked like a reasonable reaction to my secrecy. Marcus told her plainly that hiding money from a son and secretly digging into a father-in-law's net worth before rushing a wedding date weren't the same thing at all, and she didn't have a good answer for that. He also told me her mother Sherry had gotten involved, calling him directly to insist he was overreacting, that every family looks out for its future, which only confirmed for Marcus that Sherry had known exactly what her daughter was up to from the start. By the end of that call, Marcus told Brooke he needed space, packed a bag, and drove out to stay with an old buddy from high school, instead of going back to their apartment that night. He told me he wasn't making any final decisions out of anger, that he wanted a clear head first, but that something had broken between them he didn't believe could get fixed, not after seeing that folder. Not after hearing her own voice on that recording, explaining herself to a lawyer like it was the most ordinary request in the world. I told him I was proud of him for handling it with a clear head instead of rage. And he said something back that's stuck with me ever since. "You were protecting me before I even knew there was anything to protect me from." 5 weeks later, Marcus filed for an annulment, his own lawyer explaining that given how fast things had unraveled, and the clear evidence of what she'd really been after before the marriage even happened, it was a cleaner path than dragging out a divorce. Brooke didn't fight it much once she understood the recording, and Ray's report existed as documented proof, smart enough to know that dragging this out in public would only make her look worse in the end. Sherry called Marcus a handful more times, trying to smooth things over on her daughter's behalf. But Marcus had stopped picking up by then, told me he'd already said everything he needed to say. I finally sat down properly with Marcus a few weeks after that. No folders, no recordings, just the two of us at my kitchen table on a slow Sunday afternoon, and I told him the rest of it, the parts I'd skipped over in the rush of that first hard conversation. I told him about Dale, about the years of distance between us, about the guilt I still carried for never trying harder to fix things before he passed. I told him that $11 million sat there, almost like a strange, silent apology from a brother who never once said sorry out loud while he was living. I told him I wanted to set some of it aside for him properly, with a real lawyer, paperwork done the right way this time, not hidden, not rushed, and definitely not connected to anybody who hadn't earned his trust yet. He cried a little at that, not from sadness this time, but something closer to relief. And he told me he didn't care near as much about the money as he cared about the fact that I'd been quietly watching out for him the whole time, even when he had no earthly idea there was anything to watch out for. It's been just about a year now since that Saturday morning Brooke walked into my kitchen with a lawyer trailing behind her like she already owned the place. Marcus is doing well, moved a couple towns closer to me, finally taking some night classes for something he's wanted to study for years, but never had the room for while he was busy planning a wedding for a woman who was really just planning an inheritance. We talk almost every day now, real conversations, not the careful surface level kind we used to have back when I was carrying a secret, without even realizing how much that secret was quietly protecting him the whole time. I still think about my brother some nights, about the years we lost to stubbornness and pride, and about the strange way his money ended up doing something he probably never once intended, exposing a woman who would have hurt his nephew if I hadn't stayed quiet long enough to see her clearly first. Folks sometimes ask me if I regret not telling Marcus about the inheritance before that wedding, and the honest answer is no, not for one single second. If I'd told him, if I'd told anybody, Brooke would have had exactly what she wanted from the very start, and I never would have seen who she really was until it was far too late to do anything about it. Staying quiet was never about hiding money from my own son. It was about giving the truth enough room to show itself on its own, without me forcing it, without anybody having a reason to fake a kindness they didn't actually feel. Thank God I didn't say a word, because that silence gave me exactly what I needed. Real proof, real clarity, and a son who's safe, single, and finally free to build a life with somebody who wants him for who he is, and not for what his old man is quietly worth. If you stuck with me this far, you already know this story was never really about the money. It was about paying attention. If you got something out of it, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe for more real family stories, and tell me down in the comments, neighbor to neighbor, what you would have done in my place. Claude responded, "Sometimes love looks like silence, not secrecy. Sometimes love looks like silence, not secrecy. Watching quietly, waiting patiently, letting the truth reveal itself in its own time, that can protect the people we love more than any warning ever could. Trust your gut when something feels off, and never be afraid to look closely at those who ask too many questions about what isn't theirs yet. Family is worth watching over, gently, for as long as it takes." A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while hoping to share a genuine, positive life lesson with you.